This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Ironman has perhaps the most grounded and down-to-earth visual effects that I've ever seen. And by this, I don't just mean how they consistently made sure that each and every effect was somewhat tied into this film's narrative, but also the absurd lengths that they went to make sure that every digital element of this character could interplay with reality in this logical and meaningful way. Because behind the scenes, almost every bit of CGI in this film also purposefully had some kind of practical element to it as well. Meaning that even though this film did still have a lot of ridiculous comic book moments, each and every one of them still had to account for and therefore basically be limited by what could actually be achieved for real practically on set. All of which led to this film having this subtle feeling where everything you see on screen could actually be somewhat plausible in real life. And so that's why in this video we're going to break apart this grounded approach to explore how exactly these practical limitations made so much of Iron Man look so good, but also why other parts of Iron Man looked comparatively so bad, and what we can learn about the genius of this film's visual effects from this, before finally then looking as to why the first Iron Man film looks better than any other film in the MCU, and how the visual effects choices in this film rippled across every single one of his appearances to make Iron Man into the iconic character that he is today. So, to explore all of this and more, get your cheeseburger and escape the terrorist goon cave as we dive into the visual effects of Iron Man. So, why did this film have such a razor focus on keeping its visuals grounded? Well, despite this film's director, Jon Favreau, being known nowadays for things like The Mandalorian and its big 360-degree fully CGI soundstage, back before making Iron Man, he was actually a pretty outspoken critic of CGI, often discussing how too much CGI can be detrimental to the emotional weight of the film, and how filmmakers will often go way too far with the technology and just thoughtlessly add elements for the sake of it, just because now CGI gave them the freedom to do so. And so because of this mindset, Jon Favreau would often go well beyond the call of duty just to avoid using CGI at all costs. For example, in his 2005 film, Zathura, he went miles out of his way and decided to copy what the older Star Wars films did and used little detailed miniature models for his spaceships, even though the prequels had already proved that CGI ships could look both fantastic and do the job just as well, if not better. And so, despite knowing that CGI was going to be absolutely mandatory for making a film like Iron Man, Favreau still wanted to maintain his approach of doing things as practically as possible. However, even though there was this massive focus on practical effects, I personally believe that this film's visual quality went beyond just using practical elements themselves and was more about the mindset behind their inclusion and how this influenced every single aspect of this film. And to properly highlight this brings me to the visual effects of the Iron Man suits themselves. Because, in terms of visual effects technology, I see this film as a bit of a spiritual successor to Transformers, as it was mostly done by the same company, ILM, and it was also about metallic characters who just blow stuff up. But what separates Iron Man from Transformers is the fact that Iron Man is actually much more plausible to craft with practical effects, as due to him being only a few inches taller than your typical human, it meant that it was entirely possible for a real physical suit to actually be present on the set whenever the character has to do anything simple like walking or standing around. And what I found really interesting about these real suits is that these days they are what people immediately point to as the definitive reason as to why this film was so realistic. And yeah, for sure, it certainly did help with a lot of things like lighting reference, reflection reference, framing cinematic camera moves and so on, but it turns out that, in the end, only around 40 of the approximately 350 shots of Iron Man in this film actually featured the real suit, and the rest were all its completely digital counterpart. And this was because, whilst the original plan was to go hard and use these practical suits as much as possible, it turns out that the fully detailed suits were actually just too heavy for anyone to actually be able to do anything particularly versatile in, to the point where, for the Mark I suit, they needed CGI assistance just to do simple things like crouching or even walking down a shallow hill. And so, because of limitations like this, the team at Industrial Light and Magic instead decided to go down down a completely different and much more CGI dependent route, where essentially they would have Iron Man's actor, Robert Downey Jr., wear little bits of the suit in addition to those weird spotty pajamas that would capture his movement on the computer, which would then allow the visual effects team to more easily add the vast majority of this suit digitally, thus causing Robert Downey Jr. to have no restrictions whatsoever on his physical performance. But now, when I say this data was just captured on the computer, as usual it makes it sound like it's the computer doing all of the work here. But of course, in reality, there's loads and loads of animators behind the scenes painstakingly tweaking this to make it work. Because the problem here was that if you're motion capturing a completely CGI character like Davy Jones, then you actually have quite a high degree of wiggle room for mistakes in this matching process, because if you're going to replace everything anyway, then you have full control over any capturing problems that arise. But here they were, I think for the first time, having to match the CGI elements exactly up to the movement of the performer. And so to keep things lined up, this captured data and its subsequent animation had to be done absolutely perfectly. And so yeah, considering all of this, given that he was actually largely CGI, but people tend to say that this film looks good because he was largely practical, shows just how good this CGI was and just how effective this grounded mindset from the director was as well. And to properly highlight just how good this was, here's a little test for you guys. In this scene, can you tell me whether the gloves are CGI or real? I'll give you a second, feel free to type your guess in the comments. And the answer is, if you said they were CGI, you were wrong, and if you said they were real, you were also wrong, because it turns out that they didn't actually have enough props to film this scene, and so one glove was real, but the other glove had to be added with CGI, and the fact that we can't tell that is just such a telling sign of the absolute perfection of this film's visuals. But now, whilst this gives us a great insight into how far they went to keep things practical, even though so much of this was going to be replaced with CGI anyway, none of this has fully helped to explain why this down-to-earth and grounded mindset was so good and how it was able to elevate so much of the rest of the film's quality. And so, to expand upon this, I believe there were 3 scenes in particular which give us the perfect insight into the absurd lengths that this film went to stay grounded. And the first of these brings us to the fantastic Mark II flight scene and just how particularly Jon Favreau demanded the lighting stay consistent. Because this scene actually presented a pretty massive problem, as given that this was the scene where we finally see Tony master flight, it's pretty important that we as the audience can properly see the suit so that we too can partake in that feeling of flying. But of course, with this entire scene being both set in the darkness of night and way up in the sky, it meant that it was very easy for the darkly lit Iron Man to just get lost against the inky blackness of the night sky, which would effectively ruin the entire scene. Because if we can't see him, then what's the point? It'd be like the end of Edge of Tomorrow where you just have to guess what's going on. But of course, in CGI land, this visibility shouldn't be any sort of problem whatsoever. Because given that there's so much CGI in these shots, the visual effects team has all the freedom they need to just change the lighting until Iron Man was fully illuminated and fully visible. And so the problem was instead that, in service of realism, Jon Favreau demanded that absolutely no lighting cheats could be used, meaning that in this scene, Iron Man's illumination could only come from logical sources that were already there, like the moon, the Ferris wheel, or the glow from Iron Man's thrusters, all of which must have been an absolute nightmare to tweak and balance in order to keep the character looking visible. And to be honest, looking at this now, there are actually a few times where it's kind of hard to make Iron Man out, but sacrificing this visibility in service of realism was absolutely worth it, because in losing Iron Man against this darkness, there's now just such a weight of reality to this scene, and it makes it so much more engaging than most other power show-off scenes that I've seen, because now it really feels like you're up there flying around with Tony because there's just no visual trickery at play whatsoever. And so presumably this lighting mandate is a mindset that also extended and contributed to a lot of the film's other fantastic visuals as well, although that is just a guess as I have no real source for that. But what I do have a source for is the sheer amount of effort that they put into grounding this second scene that we're going to analyze for this grounded mindset, and just how effective the end result of this mindset was. was. But before we get to that, I wanted to talk to you about the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace. Because I've recently been using Squarespace to build my very own website, and I've been blown away by just how simple it was to do so. Because when it comes to building a website to sell things, I've always been intimidated by making a website that actually looks good enough to sell anything, and the actual technical, scary back-end programming of this sales process. But by setting up this unified color palette for the entire site, and then dropping in these pre-made templates which instantly conform to said color palette, within seconds I had a fantastic looking foundation which only needed minimal tweaks to become my dream website. And then beyond this, I was shocked at how well things like plugins just worked, as with complete ease I was able to fully integrate a custom clothing design store into my site despite having zero technical knowledge about how any of this works. And what was fantastic about this was that Squarespace just handled all of the scary stuff, like payment methods, programming the store, adding VAT to the purchases, and just much more. So basically the entire process was just ridiculously simple for both me to set up and for my clients to use. So whether you're just starting out or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to build the exact website you want and then sell whatever you want, all without having to mess around with anything scary or technical. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/CGY to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain when you use the code CGY. And with that, now back to the video and back to the second scene which I wanted to analyze for this grounded approach. And that was, of course, the fantastic dogfight scene. Because this dogfight is a sequence that in any other movie would have probably just been completely computer generated. Because there's not really anything complicated like humans here, and so theoretically it's relatively simple to just synthesize all of this on the computer with CGI. And by using lots of CGI, like we said earlier, you'd get an absurd amount of creative freedom and therefore be able to have whatever crazy dynamic action movements or camera positions you want. But despite all of this freedom, once again, Jon Favreau elected not to do this in a CGI synthetic way, and instead went to the insane effort of shooting large amounts of this sequence completely for real. But now, sadly, there is actually very little behind the scenes footage of this, and so, ironically, for visualization purposes, I am going to have to use lots of CGI to help explain things, but essentially what he had were these 1960s era training aircraft that he used to both plan and then film real footage of the vast majority of this chase sequence that we see in the final film. And then, later on, he'd have his visual effects crews come in and replace these aircraft with Ironman and modern day jets. And he made this choice to keep the baseline of this entire sequence real, as he believed that shackling the dogfight to reality would generate a far more photorealistic result. Because in real life, basically the only way that you can film a dogfight like this is from the perspective of sort of a second camera plane. And so by filming this for real, Jon Favreau was basically letting reality both limit and determine essentially everything about the production of this scene. Because now, with this limitation of shooting from another plane, only very specific things like certain camera movements or lenses could actually be capable of capturing a sequence like this. And so by having to adhere to these restrictions, you just naturally end up with this much more realistic result, because now you get all of the real world byproducts and imperfections of these limitations that you also saw in airborne practical effects heavy films like Top Gun, like logically correct lens flares, mist in the air, or even just the subjects slightly going out of the frame where the filming plane couldn't keep up with them. All of which means that by the time you actually get around to adding the CGI, of which there was still invisibly loads, you just naturally already have such a realistic result. And so considering that all of this film's visual effects were completed in like 13 months, whilst films like Transformers probably had something closer to 24 months, this practical baseline was probably a massive help towards keeping things looking consistent. But now, speaking of consistency, this does actually bring me to the third effect that I wanted to analyze for this grounded approach. Because of all of the fantastic scenes in this film, there was always one that stood out to me as just a little bit worse than the rest. And that was this scene here where we see Tony suit up in the Mark III Iron Man. But what I love about this scene is that by analysing why it looks kind of worse than the rest, we can reveal so many other reasons as to why this film's visuals were so realistic. Because it turns out that, for budget reasons, this entire suit-up scene was actually cut very early on in the film's production and was therefore never even recorded, which was something that Jon Favreau wasn't particularly happy about, as now it meant that we as the audience just kinda had to guess how Tony got in and out of this suit. And so it was also lucky for us as the audience that later on Marvel managed to free up the resources to actually insert this sequence back into the film. But it was unlucky for the visual effects team that by the time these resources were freed up, the filming of Iron Man had already concluded and Robert Downey Jr. was off working on other things. And so this meant that the vast majority of this scene actually had to be pulled together by using resources from other bits of the film. For example, a lot of the backgrounds from throughout this sequence were actually made by cherry picking parts of that Mark II 360-degree shot and then compositing them behind a stand-in performer who then had his face replaced digitally with Robert Downey Jr.'s. Meaning that, in the end, the only real shot of Robert Downey Jr. throughout this entire sequence was that final moment of the suit-up, which means that it's actually quite impressive that it even looks this good, because this whole thing was just a digital patchwork of other scenes from the film. But what I find much more impressive about this sequence is that its pitfalls visually lend so much credence to a lot of Jon Favreau's mindset towards visual effects. Because the one time that the scene wasn't meticulously planned to feature loads of practical elements, like having a real Ironmonger suit to sit in or lifting up this car here for real, the whole thing did look just that little bit worse. But of course, given the afterthought nature of this scene, this may not be the most fair comparison, but I do reckon that if this scene was filmed with similar practical elements, it probably would have looked just as good as every other moment in the film. So this slightly dodgy scene does give us an insight into what a heavily CGI Iron Man, helmed by a different director, may have looked like. But now, up until this point, I have largely only really been praising this film's practical effects. But of course, the reason this film works is also because the CGI these practical effects were paired with was just exceptional. And so, understanding this film's CGI achievements is also absolutely crucial to understanding just what it was that made Iron Man look so good and just how it's aged so gracefully. Because here's the thing, lots of people like to say that the only reason why films like Iron Man or Transformers look so good is because CGI metal is easier to get looking right than organic forms of CGI like Davy Jones. Which, yeah, does have a massive degree of truth to it, but in Iron Man's case, it turns out that creating these metallic surfaces was actually its own very unique nightmare. Because the armor's metallic surfaces, especially on the Mark II suit, were just so absurdly reflective that a lot of the standard approaches towards creating CGI materials just couldn't work on it. For example, a typical technique was to get the real-world materials and scan them with these little lasers that could pick up all of their physical surface properties and then duplicate that on the computer for you, easily giving you a more accurate-to-life digital material. But the metal on the Mark II suit was just so reflective that these lasers just kept bouncing off of its surfaces. And so limitations like this really meant that the team had no choice but to essentially brute force these surfaces. Because when you have all of these fantastic practical effects that you need to absolutely match your CGI up to, and you also have all of Jon Favreau's presumed mandates that wouldn't let them cheat or cut corners, like we said in the first flight sequence, then the team at ILM basically had no choice but to get these digital surfaces operating as exact copies of the original. And so the advancements they made in photorealistic metals in this film is just absurdly underrated. Because whilst, yeah, films from the 90s had pretty good chrome-looking metals, what Iron Man had to accomplish was that brushed metal feeling, where you get the sense that a paintbrush has moved through the metal, which was apparently an absolute nightmare to get right because of all of the tiny little microscopic details that brushed material needs, and just how specifically the light has to bounce around within these tiny strokes within that texture. And then on top of this, unlike other metal-heavy CGI films like Transformers, Iron Man has no dirt and no grime to hide its metallic textures behind. And instead, these metals were deliberately on full display so that we as the audience could see just how cool this suit was. And so considering all of this, again, the fact that 40 shots in this film used the real suit and all the rest were CGI and we can't properly tell which is which really goes to show just how right they got this. And so if you are interested in really getting into how they manifested this metallic material, there's an absurdly detailed paper that I've attached to this video somewhere that ILM published a few years back that properly discusses the technology of everything from Iron Man to Terminator Salvation. It's a bit too nerdy and a bit too complex to get into here, but if no girls at school will talk to you, then reading it is a pretty great substitute for their attention. But you know what? Beyond all of this film's achievements, perhaps the most unique thing about Iron Man's visuals is how these efforts to create a grounded, realistic, and believable character rippled out across the next decade of filmmaking, with each fresh appearance of Iron Man in the MCU being able to draw upon and then iterate over the fantastic foundation that this film laid in order to accurately and interestingly evolve the character. Because there's just so many little bits of effort with the CGI that I just could not fit into this video. Like, for example, how they purposefully made sure all of this crazy tech could actually fit inside of the suit, or how they stuck people in wind tunnels to figure out how the air would actually move around a man in flight, or how they logically determined what sorts of flaps the suit would need in order to be able to properly steer itself throughout the air, or how they meticulously had to balance the heroic poses and movements of Iron Man against the human character of Tony Stark, or his incredibly complex and detailed heads-up display, which invented an entirely new type of camera angle, and we have an entire video on this channel, all of which was done in service of making sure that as much as possible of this character would actually make sense, and all of which was carried into each and every one of his subsequent MCU appearances. And what was really nice about this was that because all of these Iron Man appearances came from such a grounded and well thought through place, it meant that as Iron Man's technology evolved across the MCU, it's much easier for us to generally accept its presence, despite it getting kind of ridiculous towards the end, because it always has the logical weight of this first film there to hold it up. And I just feel this logical logic is something that's sorely lacking from a lot of superhero films these days. Because nowadays a new character will show up and have all these cool powers and just be able to do just all of this stuff. And very rarely do we actually get the chance to understand how, and more importantly why, what they can do actually came about. Which I think does weaken your connection to that character. Because if you never quite know what their limits or restrictions are, then why should their losses and victories mean anything to us? And so, with all of this in mind, from the visual effects to the story to even the characters, I think it's very fair to say that Iron Man 1 is a film that's aged absurdly well. But now, before we wrap this video up, I do think I've inadvertently been giving the practical effects a lot more of the credit for Iron Man's visual success than the CGI, which really wasn't my intention. And so to somewhat counterbalance that, I think this quote from Jon Favreau from when he spoke with Cinefex really captures the importance of the CGI in this film and just how much Jon Favreau clearly learnt to love it across the course of this film's production. And the quote is, "I never actually hated CGI. I'm very much a fan of computer animation, and I think the way Pixar does stuff is sublime. What I don't like is CGI being used when you could shoot something practically. King Kong was an example of where CGI was used correctly, and studying how Peter Jackson used CGI in that film made me realize that there was a right way to do it. You need good preparation, you need practical effects mixed in with it, you need enough time, and you need to work with the right visual effects artists. For Iron Man, I not only had Robert Downey Jr., who gave the character a personality, a heart, and a soul, I also had visual effects magicians who brought a lot of artistry to it. Working with the vendors I did and the crew that I did, Iron Man was a great experience, and I can even say that I love CGI now," which I think is just a very nice little character arc for Jon Favreau there, which in turn also really helps to highlight just how important this film's CGI was to its success. And with that, we've reached the end of the video, and I would just like to thank all of my Patreon subs for their support and for helping keep these videos as high quality as possible.